Okay, and welcome everyone to our AECT GSA Graduate Student Assembly webinar on quality instructional design in the academic technology industry. So we're really excited to have you here to join us today to hear from three fantastic women in this field from three amazing companies. I'm going to introduce each of them and ask them to just kind of tell us a little about themselves, how they got where they are, and what drew them to the field of instructional design. So let's begin with Dr. Amy Lomellini, who is the Product Accessibility Lead at Anthology, which, correct me if I'm wrong, used to, or does, but was Blackboard and was acquired, and maybe you could explain all that.
Yeah, so Anthology is Blackboard. It's a lot of different companies. So campus labs, campus management, iModules, lots of different products. Basically, every technology that higher education might use, we probably have a product or a solution for that. So Blackboard is one of them, but there's like a gajillion more. So a little bit about myself. I'm Amy Lomellini, and I actually got into online learning and instructional design and everything by being a student myself. So I was living abroad in Peru and knew I wanted to complete my degree. And so I completed my degree completely online. And then when I moved back to the States eventually, I was like, oh, this is a job. Like you can do this. Learned more about instructional design. And then I went to Boise State where I got my master's and my doctorate. And then I worked for a while in higher ed as an instructional designer. I've held a lot of different jobs in higher ed, marketing, advisor, but mainly instructional designer and assistant director of online learning. And throughout my time, I myself am disabled. So I kind of always brought that perspective to what I was doing. And then I realized that there is a lot of work to be done at the intersection of accessibility and educational technology. So as of last year, I went out for this position at Anthology, and it has been wonderful. So now my main role is basically to work with our product teams and help to get everybody thinking about accessibility, work with our clients. So I get the honor of meeting with all different clients from all around the world, work with them, hear their needs, understand their stories, and bring that back to our product teams to continue to improve the products.
Thank you. And thank you for the wonderful work that you're doing. As someone who is neurodivergent and has a neurodivergent family too, it's great that this is kind of one of the ways that we're shifting the focus to the learner, which is great. So our next speaker today is Dr. Bethany Simunik, who is the Vice President of Innovation and Research at Quality Matters.
Yes, thank you so much. Really happy to be here for this discussion. A little bit about, I guess, my origin story. And I came into the field of instructional design in a little bit of a different way, but I think it shows that you can switch careers. So I'm a former faculty member, and I was teaching quite happily face-to-face for a number of years. And then I was asked to teach my first course online. This was about 15 years ago. And I said yes, because I thought, well, how hard can that be? I don't have to come to campus. This is going to be easier. And so this was a long time ago. This was before there was a lot of training and all of the development that we have now for online teaching. So that is kind of how I got into instructional design. I left full-time teaching, and I got so really invested in this idea of how can we do online learning well. And part of that, of course, is good design. I didn't know the differences in the instructional design approach for the online learning environment. So I made a career switch. I left teaching. I became an instructional designer, and I kind of started back out at that level, working with faculty. So I did that for a number of years, and then I moved into a more administrative position, and I led some ID teams, developed instructional design processes, and I love the field of instructional design, but I don't have a degree in it. So I'm somebody that, I got all my degrees before I found my love for ID work. I have some certificates and whatnot, but a little bit of a different pathway to get here. Yeah.
That's really exciting and encouraging to hear that, yes, you don't necessarily have to have had this big history. Like,
right.
Instructional designers come from all over, which is really interesting.
Yeah. And back then, there weren't a lot of ID-focused degrees, to be honest. So 15, 20 years ago, you did not have the program and degree opportunities that you do now.
Yep. Yes, exactly. And then our third speaker is Jessica Jackson, who is the Director of Professional Learning for the Learner Variability Project at Digital Promise.
Hi, it's nice to be here with all of you. So my background prior to coming to Digital Promise was in education. I was a teacher for many years, primarily elementary, and then I moved into leadership, where a lot of it becomes training adults. How do you coach and train adults, and how do we, really interested in, like, how do we get people to change practices? What does it take to make a practice effective? All the different pieces of that. And so have always been interested in the research behind things and understanding how the learning process works, both for students and then later for adults. And so at the Learner Variability Project, we really get to bring all that information together into our web app in a way that help people make sense of it all. But also, as in this role, I've had to learn the skills of instructional design to build out different programs and courses and things for people, and throughout our partnership. So similarly, it's been a lot of on-the-job learning and training, and really delving. One of the things I love in this role and in my company is just to be able to delve into the research behind some of it, and then really try to put that into practice through the different things that I get to design. So
great. So we've got a broad perspective here, which is great, because there are just so many things that instructional designers do. There's no like one ID with one job description. So if you were like new to this field, or as like a young student, or transitioning in from another career, so Bethany, you mentioned coming in from a faculty role, and Jessica, you mentioned coming in from K through 12 as a classroom teacher. What do you need to do to change careers, to get into the ID field? And we had a question in the chat too from Heather, who was looking about filling gaps in knowledge, any specific kinds of training you might do.
Well, one thing that I would suggest is, and I want to preface this by saying, I kind of feel as though there's two definite pathways within instructional design. There's the more academic instructional design work, and then there's more corporate ID work, and they are different. So if you were working within a higher ed organization, a K-12 organization, or for an organization like mine, Quality Matters, which is a nonprofit, but it's educational serving, so it's an ed adjacent. I think that is a more particular type of academic instructional design that differs a little bit from corporate. So I have a lot more recommendations for that academic type of bent than the corporate. But I think, getting involved even with some of these organizations, and I'm going to put a link here in the chat. So this is, one example. This is Penn State's ID to ID mentoring program. This is, I think, a great fit for like early career IDs, or if you're starting out. And again, this has that more academic ID lens to it. But you get paired up with an instructional designer who maybe has a little bit more experience in the field. There's also training through organizations like mine, Quality Matters. The Online Learning Consortium has workshops for IDs. EDUCAUSE has some workshops, as well as leadership programs for IDs. So I was, trying to address Heather's really good question here in the chat about, other training that might be able to fill that gap in your, current coursework, or even augment what you're doing. So I think, part of making that switch, or moving more deeply into, and again, academic ID work, is integrating with this community as well. Like QM has a QM IDA program, and I think it's good to really start to talk to instructional designers that are currently doing this work and currently in their field. My top two suggestions, though, are to get a very, very strong grounding and really intimate understanding in how people learn, because you are really leading that conversation when you're working with subject matter experts who most frequently are faculty. And, I can say this as a former faculty, no shade at all on faculty, but a lot of us don't really have courses, even in our doctoral program, for good teaching or how people learn or how to design courses. I did not have the benefit of any at all design course in my doctoral work. So I had been teaching for 6 years before I found, oh, there's some basic facets here of instructional design that I should have been taught. So in a lot of ways, you might be leading those efforts. I'd say get a good foundation in that. And also, this is my second one, learn the research that is related to how people learn, good design, good teaching, because that is something that is so persuasive when you work with faculty. They really want to know that the suggestions and guidance that you're giving is really research-based. And sometimes when you're forming that collaborative team with them, that really shows them that you have that understanding and knowledge base, and they can have that confidence in you, to move forward. So a couple suggestions there, but
yeah, I think those were wonderful suggestions. And I really want to echo the how people learn thing. I think that is essential. So I am now in more of the corporate land and less of the academia land. And I think what's important is really understanding when you need different types of learning and what that looks like. And in corporate, it's not always a course, right? You're not necessarily going to get a developer to take a course. So it's really thinking through what motivations are and understanding how people learn to be able to solve the problem. So at the end of the day, regardless of where you work as an ID, the goal is that there's some sort of a problem that can be addressed with learning. And then, whatever that learning looks like, it could be a job aid, it could be awareness, it could be all sorts of different things. So in addition to Bethany's suggestions there, I also think social media, reach out to people. I've had people reach out to me on LinkedIn and be like, hey, just curious about your title. Like, what does that mean? What do you do? And, we try when we have time to be able to respond to those kinds of requests. But really following people, follow what they're posting and finding your niche. So for me, my niche was accessibility, just because I had personal and professional experience in that area. And I found that it was sort of the less traveled path of a typical ID. So a lot of ID programs don't have accessibility courses or programs or anything like that. So I went out and learned more about it and made that my thing. And I think that's what helped me to stand out and be able to get this position that I got now. And to echo Bethany's other point, I found this job by being on the Ally. So Ally is a product from Anthology that helps provide alternative formats for content so that anyone can download an alternative format and use it in whatever way they want. Also helps faculty learn more about accessibility. Long story, I was on a board just for users of that product, and there's like a community around it, and they posted this job, and I was like, yes. So then I applied for the job, and that was, so just being on those different boards, integrating in the different communities with whatever you're interested in, whatever area of instructional design, I think that can go a long way.
So great points. I agree with all of those. And I think I would just add, especially starting out, is to really reflect on your own experiences as a learner and think about what were the experiences that really had a significant impact on your learning and what were some of the features that made that impactful, and think about how that changes across context. So something that we talk a lot about and that comes up in the research on learner variability is that, how we engage in person can be very different from how we engage online. How we engage with math can be very different from reading. And so really thinking about what the content of what you're doing and the environment can really impact different learners. And that's really what, our learner variability navigator tries to show, is just that all these factors, your motivation, as Dr. Lomellini, sorry, mentioned.
Lomellini, no one ever gets it right. It's okay.
Sorry. Motivation can really change, right? And so really thinking about how are you tapping into that? How are you accounting for that? And it can be different in a course that students, or participants choose to be in versus one that they have to be in for work, right? And so just thinking through like some of the different reasons why people also may be going through the course that you're designing, I think can be really important, and understanding that, which is all part of just understanding how people learn, but again, how that environment, how that intersects with the environment and the learning environment.
And I will put a little plug in for the Learner Variability Navigator. I'll put that link in the chat again, because you all have recommended some great ways of doing some continuing learning in a organized capacity with different organizations. But the Learner Variability Navigator, what's really cool about that is that any one of these aspects of variability, you can click on them and there's these research articles. So you can do your own continuing learning about different aspects of learner variability, which is really cool. And I did also put a couple of suggestions for books in the chat. If you have other things that anybody in the that's a participant here that wants to share about a good resource, please share that in the chat. And if you have questions, please do add those to the chat as well. So it does sound like you have a lot of commonalities, but Bethany, you did mention kind of the difference between corporate and academic instructional design. And all of you, while you work in academic technology, you're more in that corporate role than you are in like a instructional designer in higher ed. So how do those two roles look different? Amy mentioned, you're not giving a course all the time. So what are you doing in your day-to-day jobs, or an ID in your organization? What are they doing that's a little bit different than in higher ed?
Want me to start? Okay. So I guess in higher ed, I was meeting with faculty on a regular basis and designing academic courses, working with them throughout the semester. There was a lot of that education piece. We were working on accessibility and quality and all sorts of other things as well. Now in tech, it's a little bit different. Like I said, we do still have courses, so I can still design courses. But for me now, I'm finding the issue, right? So kind of speaking to what Jessica was talking about, I have to go out and identify, like, where is the gap? Why is this a knowledge gap? What do we need here? What does that look like? What's the problem I'm trying to solve? What's the user's problem, or the learner's problem in this case, right? The employees at my company, like, what do they need from me? How can I better support them? And that really varies a lot. Sometimes they need a resource and I can say, here's a quick website, there, it's already done. Other times, maybe it's an empathy story. Maybe they don't understand why that, certain feature would, do something or exclude someone, right? So I can talk to them and bring in different people to talk and kind of help them see that. Other times it's a job aid, there's a process, or maybe we need a process, right? So I think what I really like about my job right now is that it's something different all the time. So every time I talk to a different group, I have to figure out what the underlying issue is. And I think that often gets lost in ID work. Sometimes in higher ed, it's like, you have to make this course. This is the course. It is what it is. That's all you can do, right? And yeah, you work with different courses and everything, but here, maybe a course isn't the right answer. And so I get to have that creativity to come up with what is the right answer here. And maybe I try it and it's not the right answer. That's okay too, and so working with different populations with different skill sets all around the world is really something just I like, that, every day is different.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just add to, being able to work in a variety of formats. It's not always an LMS, that we're building courses in. And so really, again, understanding, like, how does this integrate? Because I'm often working in K-12 where we're delivering professional development to teachers, but that can look a lot of ways, right? And so understanding what other initiatives they have and how we can align our content with that, what formats they prefer and things like that. So it is a lot of just, because I'm often dealing with the same content, right? It's always something about learner variability, but the format looks a lot different depending on what our partners' needs are. And so really being able to think creatively about the tools and different ways to present that. And sometimes that can include, like we create professional learning community guides that create more like opportunities to do things in small group collaborative spaces versus online spaces, and how to partner that with online materials and things like that. So kind of just thinking about the formats that work for the partner.
Now, I anticipated this was a question, so I also kind of polled the IDs here at QM, including our Senior Manager of Instructional Design, Jillian Jevic. So this is a group answer to this. I think in general, the big difference is audience and purpose. So, even for example, when I was at an institution and I was working with faculty to design courses, it can be a little bit formulaic in the sense that you develop a process, but you know that you are always, for example, designing an academic course that is going to be of a specific length. You know that it's going to be for example, undergraduate students or graduate students. It's going to be a 15-week full-term course or a shortened 7 or 8-week course. So you have these kind of parameters in place, and you really get to know your audience and the purpose for that because it's very academically focused. When you move to, I think, an ed serving organization, like QM, there is much more of this idea of, as the ID, you are the subject matter expert because you have that expertise in learning. So in this sense, you're creating professional development, faculty development, staff development for instructional designers, other staff that work in online learning. And that's a difference in audience that is very distinct. So when I'm designing for faculty instead of for students, think about all the ramifications of that. You now have a much more astute audience that is going to evaluate that training in a very different way, faculty versus students. There's also, differences in terms of the pace of change. And again, this kind of goes back to the purpose as well. So when you're developing an academic course, you may have your maintenance and revision design cycles like every 3 to 5 years. So you design a course, the institution, you and the faculty member or faculty cohort, you put so much time and work into that. And then let's say your institution says every 3 or 5 years, we're going to go back and revise this, make sure that it has timely materials, all that stuff. When you work in an ed adjacent organization, typically that 3 to 5 year time period, that's a little bit too long because information and the pace of things changing in terms of education, or in my specific case, online learning, that's a lot faster than, for example, how the field of chemistry might change in the past 5 years. So you can expect a lot more updating, and you're also, you're not thinking in terms of, is this a 15-week course or 7 or 8-week course? You may have, so for example, using QM workshops, we have asynchronous courses that are 2 weeks long. We have synchronous virtual experiences that are 2 hours long. So when you're designing things for faculty development or professional development, really, and this kind of goes back, Amy, to what you were saying, you have to think about the intent of that and who you're designing it for, because it needs to fit their lifestyle, their training needs at that time. And that might be short and discrete, or it might be, again, that longer 2-week asynchronous course. But it's kind of daunting at first to be designing courses for faculty and other educators. It's I think a little bit a different mentality and approach than designing for students. You have to use feedback in a different way as well. So I know that when you're designing academic courses, hopefully you're collecting student feedback and utilizing that in the revision. But that's something that you absolutely have to do when you're creating professional development, because if it doesn't meet the need, no one's going to take that professional development, whether it's faculty development at an institution, that's another pathway for IDs, or faculty and professional development at a nonprofit organization.
So it sounds, from what I'm hearing from all three of you, is that these iterative cycles of design are a lot faster in your world than we would find in a higher ed institution. And yeah, so the word agile design, it also reminds me, I'll put in the chat too, of the learning experience design, which is really focused on the learner. What do we need to do? How do we create this experience so that the learner actually learns the thing that we need them to learn? which seems like a different focus than K through 12 or in higher education, where it's like, here's this content, let's just make it, design it in a way that makes sense. And then the other thing that it reminds me of that I'm not sure a lot of people are familiar with here is learning engineering, which uses an engineering approach to designing solutions for learning challenges. So it sounds like there really are some differences in what's happening in your world versus what might be happening for a higher ed instructional designer. So can you take us a little bit more in detail about like a typical work day? So some of you guys gave a little bit of detail, but say I was hired as an instructional designer at your organization, what would I probably be doing on a day-to-day basis?
I can start with this one. Well, I think, my role is not purely instructional design, so it's one of many things, but I am, often spending a good chunk of each week focused on different projects related to instructional design. And so that can, for one of those projects, it is creating a series of mini modules. So kind of thinking about what Bethany was sharing about the different, the audience and purpose. They wanted really short, 60 minutes or less, modules because teachers are tired. They don't want to take a full course. And so really thinking about how can I break this content down and then create different pathways that people can take, they can stack the modules together and make their own path kind of thing. And then I do have another partner that wants a more traditional course and kind of that has both synchronous and asynchronous components. And so working through that. But we also have a lot of other instructional designers on different teams within Digital Promise. And often times I consult with them as the subject matter expert in learner variability to help them design their course or add that in. And sometimes I am asked by partners to touch on topics that I am not a subject matter expert in. And so I will also pull in contractors or collaborators from within our organization to help build that process out. And then another piece of it is getting that good feedback and review from teachers. And so I often work with, in the past, I've had a practitioner advisory board or other people that can kind of review materials and provide that feedback along the way. And so those are some of the things I do in different stages of the process.
I would say in terms of a work day, it's a little bit similar in that, you're still working on courses and workshops. Here at QMR IDs, they spend a lot of time with content and activities and assessments, and they're more involved in those things, I would say, than a higher ed based ID often has an opportunity to be, again, because the assumption is, about learning design, about learning science. And so you are the subject matter expert, in a lot of these things. We also, though, work with community SMEs on that. So part of the workday could be for that. I would say in general, though, it's a little bit of a faster pace, again, because you're an organization that, or, QM is an organization that in large part provides faculty and professional development for online learning. So think in terms sort of like a combination of an academic faculty development center and an instructional designer, right? And because of that pace of change, especially when new topics come up. So for example, AI is a big topic right now. Accessibility of courses, an existing topic that has had lots of conversations around it for a while. During the pandemic, it was remote teaching. You don't really have the opportunity or luxury to say, well, we are inundated right now. We can't really address that, because you have people come in your organization saying, I want to learn about that. So, in that sense, I think there's a fast pace, like I said, but there's also, I think, that novelty that can provide some motivation that maybe you don't always find when you're embedded within, a college or a university, and you're continuously working on those academic courses with faculty.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. For my organization, we do have instructional designers. I sort of, like Jessica, and Bethany too, I have a sort of tangential to instructional design kind of role. So a big part of my job is meeting people and talking to them and making those connections, developing the trust, and really just like understanding where they're at in their learning, and in my case about accessibility, and understanding what their next step is, right? So, it's not going to be all the way over there. It's going to be, what is your next step, and kind of getting to the understanding of that. What does your team need? What are the questions that, you're being asked as a leader of this team? And so really getting to the root of the problem is what I do on a regular basis. And then from there, I can then go on and use what I know about learning and how people learn and what motivates them to be able to create something that's going to make an impact. And then, of course, getting the feedback from them to be able to analyze whether what I thought was going to make an impact actually did or did not. Do I have to shift course, right? And like what Bethany was saying, it is something, there's always something new. So AI and accessibility is an interesting intersection that I'm sort of exploring now. And one of the things I like about my role is, because we're at the forefront just by being an educational technology company, there's an opportunity for me to like follow my passion. So I really am interested in AI. I am now on a task force for it, right? And now I can go and do some research and, help my company lead in that aspect. I've gotten to work with partners all around the world, Microsoft, like big names, and really kind of make that impact. And again, for me, a lot of it is about making those connections and learning from people what they need, so that I can go ahead and work with them and create something that's going to be meaningful and impactful for them.
So I'm hearing a lot of like problem solving and relationships. So do you have any like specific tips or strategies, things that are like your go-tos that, when you say, okay, we've got a challenge here, how am I going to tackle it? What's your approach? Or I need to develop this relationship, how am I going to do it? What are some of your day-to-day go-tos?
For me, it's about listening. Everybody has a story and they want to tell it. And if you can sit there, if you can listen and truly listen, don't listen to reply, but really listen to what people are telling you, that makes the world of difference. You make people feel heard. You have a story to then go on and tell others, and, obviously privacy and all of that, but you know what I'm saying? So you can, but I really think that listening is how you create those relationships and that bond. That would be my number one tip.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, because I definitely agree, that was the first thing that came into my mind. A good book on ID-SME relationships is Mind Meld, Penny Ralston-Berg. I also used to recommend to instructional designers regularly, and I still do, the book Crucial Conversations. I think that instructional design as a profession, it's not just about knowing instructional design theories and frameworks. It is not just about knowing how people learn and how education works. It is about developing a relationship with your faculty member, your subject matter expert, whatever that term is that you use in your job. It's a people profession. And I think sometimes that we forget that. So you really need to develop that good relationship. And Amy, I agree with you. It's about listening. Usually, when I would work with a faculty member, I would use an ID approach where I had a set of questions and I would ask them the questions, and it was an hour to 2 hours of just listening to them talk. I would take notes, and honestly, by the end of that, I was able to scope out and give us a skeleton outline for their entire course. Why? Because they have it in their head. They already have that course in their head. The ID's job is to pull out that information and create that course that really makes the best sense for students that are going to be taking it, and that learning environment and those learning goals. So I think that is too often overlooked in instructional design work, that people-to-people connection that you really do need to make. And I think that listening is such a crucial part. Faculty do want to be heard, and they want really their passion to be respected as well. So they may not always know instructional design. They don't know, by and large, things like UDL and all the other things that you bring to the table as instructional designer. What they know forwards and backwards is their discipline. So tap into that passion, I would say, definitely through listening. Best suggestion.
Yeah, I agree with both of those. I think, listening and having those relationships are key. But I would just add to that once you have established those things, having, planning for feedback loops and being, and getting, thinking about what are the different points along the way where you're going to get that feedback, how are you going to apply it, and keep, so that it doesn't just get to the end and you've done all this work, right? And then it's not meeting the needs, or, the subject matter expert doesn't agree with it or whatever. So I think just kind of being intentional about collecting that along the way and from different people based on the work that you're doing is important.
If I could add on to that, because Jessica, that is such a good and crucial point. I think the other thing that really benefits instructional designers is knowing how to use the data from that feedback. So first of all, yes, collecting that feedback. I don't think that we do it frequently enough. Whether you're in academia or you're in corporate, it's something that needs to be embedded in the course. But then think more specifically about how you as a designer are going to use that feedback to improve that learning experience for future cohorts. So a lot of our time with IDs here at QM, for example, is utilizing that feedback from participants. And then this is part of what I do. So this is a good connection between myself and the IDs at QM. We look to see how, for example, once faculty go through a particular workshop or course, how then those faculty, how that translates into their experience as a peer reviewer, for example. So it's not just feedback from the course itself. How did it go? Did you learn? Did you like the experience? Was your facilitator good? But we also connect it then to future performance of those faculty or IDs in other endeavors related to online. So then if there's a disconnect there, we can always go back to the training and say, is this something that we need to train on more deeply? Do we need to have different types of activities here? So I'm finding that we have so many more of those conversations of really utilizing feedback and data points to improve the faculty development that we offer, much more so than when I was at an academic institution. So I think that's another good difference. I'm going to let you know also, I'm going to pop in the chat something related to feedback, but it is more for academic courses. So I know that's not exactly our conversation, but it might be helpful.
I agree with the data-informed decisions. I think one of the skills that I had going into ID was just Excel, straight Excel. I can make Excel do all kinds of things. And when I can't, I Google how to do it. Don't tell anyone. And then I can make Excel do, amazing things. And using that skill and being able to analyze that data, like they were both just saying, is so essential, not only to improve the courses and improve all of that, but taking it a step further to get buy-in at higher levels. So why do we need this? Well, here's the data on why we need this, right? Here's where there's this gap in that, right? And having all of that information in a tangible way that you can create a report for leadership is essential to be able to get the buy-in for the programs that need to happen and the education pieces that need to happen. So I think the data is a really important point as well.
So many helpful things there, because you really all emphasize the importance of understanding how learning happens, which that's how you create quality instructional design. But you don't know if you've created quality instructional design unless you collect data on it. And in my experiences, I've found that a lot of instructional designers are a little scared of data. And so do you have any tips? I know you mentioned like, oh, well, if you're not sure about how to do something in Excel, you just Google it. But how did you come to get comfortable with data and knowing how to collect it and what to do with that data?
I think sometimes data is tricky to collect, especially in academia. So you don't always have access because it's the faculty's course. You may not have access to, the student, and then the student thinks it's tied to their performance in the class. So they may say everything was great and, they didn't really mean it, but they think that the teacher can see, right? So you got to look beyond the obvious, I guess I would say, and find other ways. And sometimes it's something, maybe less data focused, but something attitudinal. Somebody comes back for more. Somebody comes back with a different passion. Somebody comes back with questions. That's all good data too, that they're coming back and they want to learn more. You probably did something right if they're coming back to you, right? Other ways, is there a change in something tangible that you can measure? So thinking through what is your goal? How do you measure that goal? And what that looks like in different scenarios is interesting, you know, and how did I become comfortable with it? Just trial and error, you know, figuring out what can and cannot do. Yeah. There's no shame in Googling. Someone just said, I agree. I don't know. Go ahead, Bethany. Did you have a different way of becoming comfortable?
There is no shame in Googling. I Google a
Right.
lot. I think sometimes data is more intimidating than it has to be. So you can really do very simple data collection and use without knowing advanced statistics, without having to do statistical analysis or even much data analysis. Even if you're doing like pre and post test questions about knowledge gains, even if you have an after workshop or after course survey where you ask participants kind of the top things that they should have learned. Did they come away with that? What additional questions did they have? Any of those things are going to give you insights into what's working and what's not. So it's not as though you have to collect all of this quantitative data and then do all these complex analyses, and if you don't have SPSS you can't do. Think of it in terms of just making it doable for you and even starting to get some good feedback. If there is, for example, something that you're developing and then there's a next level of that workshop or course, are you seeing connections or are you seeing disconnects between those that took it and went to the second course in advance? Did they have all the information that they needed in order to matriculate to that next course? So there's some easy ways, to use data that I think are not intimidating, that are, that don't really veer into, the I need to know statistics in order to do this. At the very least, just have an end of course or end of workshop survey so that participants have a chance to give you some feedback and then utilize that in good ways.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate. I do like to really have a balance of quantitative and qualitative feedback, and I think they can both kind of help balance or provide more insight into how people are responding to the course. But I also think you can just look at how they engage with different pieces of the course too, right? Like how active is the discussion board or the chat, versus other pieces to see, what does that tell you about the questions you're asking and the content, how they're processing the content. I think there's pieces of that. You can look for data in, I guess, a lot of places depending on what you have access to. I always, and I also think, like, what are their takeaways about the content and what does that show versus asking them how they liked different features within the course. And so I think there's also kind of thinking about, at least in my world, I'm often thinking about, did we change anyone's mind or did we change their practice at all? And then I'm also thinking about, did they like the course and what did they like about it? And so I'm kind of thinking about data in those two buckets and really looking and making decisions based off of kind of two different sets there.
For me, with less formalized, courses of that nature, I look at job performance and I can see a change in the way people talk about accessibility, the way they enact progress in accessibility. Different things like release notes might have more accessibility because I know they worked on more tickets now that I explained to them the importance of X, Y, and Z, right? So I can kind of gather other data. And then it all goes back to that relationship too. By developing that relationship, I can have an honest conversation. And then that loop sort of starts all over again. So we had the loop, we had some sort of knowledge or training, and then something happened. Now I go back to them and say, hey, what's next? Or what did you think? Do we need to go back to that? Something else, missing there. And we can kind of progress that way through conversations and relationships as well.
I think that perspective is so important, Amy. And I love how you put in the chat, qualitative data is data too. Absolutely. At QM, I think that I've had more opportunities, for example, to do focus groups and individual interviews than I ever had at an academic institution. So, that's something as well. Again, it doesn't have to be so quantitatively focused. Have conversations with the people that you are serving. Those focus groups and individual interviews even gave such additional insights that weren't even in my realm of thinking of, when I was considering our courses and workshops. It helps you better understand even the environment that your participants are coming from. So in our case, it's traditionally faculty and those that work in K-12 or higher ed, but even just things, surrounding their schedule and the ways that they really need to interact with faculty and professional development is so different than at an academic institution, because again, it might be better to have something as a 2-hour synchronous training versus a 1-week asynchronous training. And those are things that you may not get in a quantitative type of data collection. So talk to the people that you are creating, whether it's courses, workshops, training, whatever it is. Talk to them because they may have very different needs than you are anticipating just when you're focusing on the content and the learning outcomes, for example.
Oops, that is so exciting what you guys are all saying about data, that it is accessible and you don't have to be afraid of it. And the one thing that's really exciting to me is that, as Amy mentioned, in your world, you get more metrics. In higher ed, we basically get the LMS and what the student does in terms of learning in that course. You don't get to see, hey, they took their intro biology class this semester. Did they actually do well in the next semester? Or are they next week on the job actually making changes in their behavior, which is really pretty exciting, because then you can actually see, is this instructional design effective? So that's exciting. That is like a big sell for me for working in industry as an instructional designer. So if I wanted to get into that world, what does the job market look like? Is there job security and growth compared to higher education?
I would say definitely there's both job security and growth. I'm still seeing a plethora of instructional design jobs, in higher ed, but more and more also at organizations like QM and like I said, ed adjacent or ed serving. I think there are a lot of opportunities here, especially if you're coming from a higher ed background or a K-12 background and you have that additional knowledge. So in addition to being an instructional designer and knowing how to design, learning courses, workshops, and learning environments, knowing the landscape of higher education, how that works, how faculty work, how busy faculty are, the information and training they might need. I think that's definitely an aid, to somebody who wants a career in an educational nonprofit or an educational serving organization. But the other thing I wanted to mention is I'm also co-director of the Chloe report, the changing landscape of online education. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but we regularly poll institutions about things like staffing for online learning, including ID staffing. We had a big section on that last year in last year's survey report. And you're seeing, especially since the pandemic, an increase in institutions that know that they need instructional designers. And because of that, because online learning especially, and that's my niche, so that's what I talk about, online learning, but because that's exploding, you need faculty who are better trained, to design courses and whatnot. And because of that, you need IDs in organizations that serve faculty as well. So there is this this communal aspect and this partnership between higher ed and then non-higher ed organizations that serve higher ed or that serve K-12. So what I'm saying here is, even if you're looking to, go into an academically adjacent path, still keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in K-12 or higher ed, because that's still going to be the population by and large that you are serving.
I'll just add to that I would agree definitely that, we are a nonprofit as well that serves, a lot of schools and districts. And so having some background that can help you, understand your audience or understand your subject, I think really helps with that. And I see too that there's been this big shift in K-12 professional development to have more diversified offerings and to have more options for, on-demand training and, a variety of things, where it used to be a very in-person workshop focused style of training. And so I think that shift is only going to continue, especially as AI and ed tech products come out, and there's just going to be more demand to kind of upskill and understand how to use different products in the classroom. And so I see this as, continuing to grow, and lots of opportunities in, education, or as Bethany said, ed adjacent organizations and companies.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with everything they've said. In terms of accessibility, the field is exploding. There is just such a need for more people with knowledge, but especially instructional designers. I really do think it's a gap in most ID programs. They don't really focus a lot on accessibility, but then when you're on the job, you're expected to know about it. And that's a tricky issue, I guess, that we have right now. And I think more and more institutions are hiring accessibility specialists because they're recognizing that gap. And I think even in instructional design, there is that that niche there that is very sought after right now in industry, in higher ed, pretty much everywhere.
So in higher ed, we often look at like the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed, things like that for job postings. Where do corporate and ed tech companies post their ID job offerings?
It's funny that you say that, because I was literally typing something about that topic in the chat as you were speaking. So I wanted to post about the QMIDA organization, because they have a listserv where they do send out jobs, and it's not just academic jobs. There's corporate ID work that's shared on there. There's nonprofit ed adjacent groups as well. I find I try to share a lot of jobs that I find as well. I'll share them on LinkedIn on my page. I know, IDs are regularly looking for positions, or to switch, from different, between different fields, academic, corporate, et cetera. So that's one. I mean, LinkedIn's a great place for this. There's also ID organizations on LinkedIn. Some are more corporate focused, some are more academically focused. There's some great corporate IDs to follow on LinkedIn as well. So social media is the larger answer. But that I did want to post that listserv. I think OLC also regularly shares instructional design positions, both academically related and non-academically related. So those are great places to look.
I'll just add, I don't know what our official policy is on where we post for Digital Promise, but I know from my own job searching experience, I looked a lot on EdSurge. They often have a lot of ed tech postings and companies there. And then, what I also discovered is that I might learn about organizations through some of these, larger sites, or even like an Indeed or something like that, but then go to their website and see a lot more postings there. And so if there's certain companies you like or you're interested in, or you discover, following up and going onto their own, often they'll just highly promote one or two jobs, but they have a lot more on their site. And so as you kind of have companies you're targeting, that's another way to think about it.
Yeah, and I think following those companies on LinkedIn, so follow the company's main one, find somebody in HR, follow them for a little bit. Like, they're going to post jobs as well. Like I said earlier, I found my job by being on an Anthology Ally user board. And they posted a job there, and that was what I wanted. So I applied there.
Cool. So it's not advertised in the newspaper anymore. It's a whole new world of how you find your job. So my last question for you all as we wrap up is, we had kind of mentioned before everyone came on about the pandemic and all of the burnout, particularly in higher ed, where the instructional designers carried the huge weight of remote instruction. So what would you recommend if someone wanted to go into instructional design in ed tech or corporate? And because it does seem so demanding with so many things changing all of the time and lots of problem solving, how do you prevent burnout in that role?
For me, maybe because I'm new, I've only been in this role for a year, but higher ed was actually more burnout for me. The demand was harsher in many ways and didn't really work well with my disabilities. Now, working from home, I'm 100% remote. I make my own schedule. If I don't feel good, I can rest for a minute and then, get to my work tonight or whatever the case may be. So I have a much more flexible schedule and I have a much better work-life balance now than I did in higher ed. Is it more demanding in some ways, right? Like it's a faster pace, but for me, I like that. I thrive in that. So I think knowing your own preferences and what's going to work for you can help determine what industry is the best match for you. Burnout is always something in diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility, all of those letters. It can be tiring to constantly try to be the advocate and the voice, but I think self-care is super important. Recognizing what you're bringing to the table, recognizing that you're important and you're doing good work and that you're making progress, and continuously reminding yourself of that progress, I think is essential to prevent burnout, but also just having that work-life balance. It's okay to turn off Slack or Teams or whatever it may be and have a night with your family, right? Like it's okay to not answer after a certain time, whatever that looks like for your schedule. So drawing those boundaries, and I have to say I'm much more intentional about my boundaries than I was in higher ed. And in higher ed, those boundaries got disrespected and because I wasn't as intentional. So I made that a point when I moved into corporate that this was what I needed to have my work-life balance. And so far, everybody has been wonderful. I am much less likely to burn out where I am now than previous, but that's my experience.
No, I would very much agree with that. In higher ed, typically, an ID could have a course load of, whatever, 6 courses. I've heard a dozen courses. I've heard more courses, per term. And that is just the load that you carry, because they have a certain number of IDs. They have a certain number of courses that either need designed or revised, and that is your workload. I found that when I moved to QM, I had much greater control over the pace and the amount and whatnot I worked on. The way that I had to guard against burnout is, and I was talking to Amy before our session started, it's almost like being a kid in a candy store that, when you come in and there's opportunities, so you can, by and large, have a lot of say in your own projects and what you want to focus on and to the degree and mapping that out and whatnot. But because of that, those of us that are really motivated and passionate and excited about this work, you want to do all the things. So definitely because of the pandemic, I made choices that burned myself out, but that's very different than being in a higher ed institution where I'm just burned out because this is my workload and it is unsustainable and I can't handle it. So I think you have a greater control over it, and sometimes that's for good and sometimes that's not for good if you're really excited about things.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. And one thing I think to add would just be, as you've done, a few of these, or you have some different projects, is kind of understanding really what does this actually entail in terms of scoping it out, and then how can you help manage people's expectations going forward, right? So sometimes it takes a few times to do this, but you have a learning curve with it. But I think that's kind of been my learning curve, is understanding, oh, this actually doesn't take me 10 hours, it takes me 20. I need to plan accordingly, and I need to manage people's expectations. And I have a tendency to want to overpromise, like how fast I can do something. And so I've really learned to just always add at least 2 or 3 weeks to that, even if I think I can do it in, 4, and that gives me more buffer, to kind of manage my process, to take some self-care and things like that. And so, again, that may not always be an option depending on where you work, but when you are owning your own projects and doing that, I think it's important to build that into your process.
That is excellent advice, and I need to take it more. So thank you, Bethany and Amy and Jessica. So much great information from you guys today. And I think we all really learned that it's for instructional designers who've been thinking that you have to get a job in higher ed. No, there is so much more out there. And it is an exciting world. And I just want to thank all three of you for sharing your time and your expertise with us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. Great discussion. I appreciated it.
Yeah. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.